And again, the headline consumer prices index stood at 3.1% in November. That's well ahead of wages, which grew at just 2.2%. It means that the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, must write to the Chancellor to explain why inflation is running so far ahead of the 2% target the government has set. Our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed, is here. So a pre-Christmas crunch for consumers with inflation at 3.1%. Has it peaked there?
Well, that's the big question. The Bank of England certainly believes that the present number this autumn was going to be the high point for inflation. The main reason for that is because when you have a currency shock, which is a lot of the reason for this inflation, so obviously sterling dropped heavily after the referendum, and when you have a currency shock like that, that tends to feed through the system relatively quickly and then feed out of the system, because inflation is a comparative number 1 year on the next. So once you're a year beyond the referendum, it tends to lessen. And the bank is certainly putting a lot of store by that and believes that it thought 3.2% would actually be the peak and then would fall next year. But what's interesting, Joe, when you actually look at the numbers, and I brought my little sheet of economic numbers with me, as you know, I like to have them all the time with me. If you look at actually the numbers that affect, you know, people and what they buy over Christmas, as you suggest, living squeeze is still with us. Looking at clothing, looking at food, alcohol and clothing, the numbers are 4.1% inflation in food, 4.5% inflation in alcohol, and 3% inflation in clothing.
So that is quite painfully high.
So for the things that actually people buy, and also that's not including transport, is at 4.5%. That's fuel, that's tickets. And so the actual things that people buy means that 3.1% is not actually what people are experiencing when they go to the shops. So actually, that squeeze is very sharp. But the Bank of England certainly believes, and most economists believes, that we're at about the high point of it.
Right, but does that mean there's going to be a sharp fall, or are we going to sort of just taper off a little bit and then stick at around 2.93%?
No, so the bank has said it wants to, obviously, well, it has to get back to target, that 2% target, over a 3-year period. So the idea is, Joe, that next year inflation would fall, and most are predicting between 2 and 2.5%. Now, because of this sterling shock feeding through, there does seem to be a lot of evidence that that will happen. But we mustn't forget, things happen that aren't forecast. So, for example, the closure of the big oil pipeline in Scotland has meant that there's some upward pressure on the oil price. The oil price is going up anyway. It could go up faster. People are using more fuel because it's very cold, and that means that inflation is affected. So inflation is difficult to forecast because things happen, and that can produce inflation pressures.
Mark Carney has to write to the Chancellor to explain why there's been this rapid rise in inflation. And you sort of wonder, fine, so he writes a letter, but apart from it being a bureaucratic procedure, what does it actually do?
It's just, we are drowning in protocols, aren't we? I mean, I know we're going to come on to Brexit in a few minutes' time, but that's a classic example currently. Can I just ask you a quick question about the numbers there? Yes. If what we're experiencing in the high street is about 4.5, what's dragging the average down to 3.1?
Well, it is that currency effect. So because that's what's called washing out of the system.
Right.
So input prices that the producers are seeing in terms of what they're buying from abroad, because the reason that inflation comes because of a sterling change is because it's more expensive to buy from abroad. And so that figure is starting to fall off because the sterling effect is washing
sucking it all down.
So that's slightly tapering in its effects. But other things like the oil price are starting to push inflation in the other direction. Also, what's called the push-through. So for a while, retailers soak up the input price inflation that they're suffering because they're buying food from abroad.
Right.
But after a bit, it starts to be pushed through to the consumer, and that's what's happening now. So that sort of bubble has moved from the retailers, the costs of importing food, and is being pushed on to the consumer. So they're now starting to experience that push-through bubble.
So what about the action that can be taken by the Bank of England Governor? If he writes this letter to explain it, and then what, it stops there, or does he have suggestions as to how to actually bring it down?
So they've raised interest rates slightly, as we know, for the first time in many years. Double them from 0.25% to 0.5%. Of course, raising interest rates tends to take money out of the system, so it's a deflationary action. So they've done that, and also they make predictions on things like the sterling effect, on things like commodity prices. But of course, when you have quite strong global growth, as you do, that has inflationary effects and tends to push up inflation. So it's a delicate balancing act. We won't see the letter actually until next year, not until next year's inflation report. By then we'll have had other inflation figures in December, which could be a little lower. So the letter writing, as you made the point, Richard, quite a bureaucratic protocol, although important, we won't actually see what the letter looks like until next February.
Mind you, you're too young to remember the 70s and the inflation we had in the 70s. I mean, it would make this conversation laughable.
Yes.
You know,
but we've had such low inflation, of course, for so long, and that's
the
difficulty, particularly before Christmas. Thank you very much for coming in. So it looks